everyone, welcome back to Black Wahala. If you've clicked on this video by chance and you like the content that connects history, sociology, and critical race theory, then stick around. Today we'll be talking about this little old movement called abolition. While you may have heard of the abolitionist movement that ended slavery, today we are talking about another abolitionist movement that arose in the 21st century. According to the scholars in Instead of Prisons, a handbook for abolitionists, an abolitionist is a person who believes that prisons have failed. They are a person who advocates the abolition of prisons as a long-term goal. They are a person who seeks to build a caring community. Prison abolitionists believe that imprisonment is a moral ill and undefendable. They believe in reconciliation, not punishment. They work with prisoners as allies rather than helpers. They realize that the empowerment of prisoners is crucial to change, that we can all challenge the system, that the message of abolition requires honest language, that crime is mainly a consequence of the structure, and that it is only a caring community in which redemption can happen. As Ruth Gilmore notes, abolition has to be green. It has to take seriously the problem of environmental harm, environmental degradation, and environmental racism. It has to be red, figuring out ways to generalize the resources needed for well-being for the most vulnerable people in our community, and it will extend to all people, and it has to be internationalist. So it has to stretch past borders. It often feels like prisons have been around since the beginning of time, but is this really the case? No.
I am so powerful. My mind, it amazes me sometimes.
The beginning of the Western penal system, which was exported to other nations through colonialism, emerged during the late 17th century and 18th century as people grew angry with public executions and torture. Systems of mass incarceration were used, but a prison reform movement arose because of the harsh conditions. Between 1787 and 1791, utilitarian scholar Jeremy Bentham shared his ideas of the panopticon, that criminals could only be productive if they were surveilled at all times. This influenced the creation of the first English penitentiary in 1816, and the first full-fledged panopticon prison was created in the United States. In the United States, after the abolition of slavery, former slave states passed new legislation revising the slave codes in order to regulate the behavior of free Black people. The new Black codes focused on a range of actions such as vagrancy, absence from work, breach of job contracts, the possession of firearms, and insulting gestures or acts, which were criminalized only when the person charged was Black. Thus, the convict lease system rose from the ashes of slavery. Former slaves who had recently been freed from a condition of hard labor for life could be legally sentenced to penal servitude. These prisons, Black convict labor, which was very extensive in the United States and is often described as even worse than slavery by historians, was essential to achieve industrialization, especially in the South. We see that prison labor, even as it emerged, was dependent on the labor of Black people, rather than protecting society and rehabilitating criminals as was claimed. This history has been the backbone of the prison industrial complex, a term that was first used in relation to California's penal system by the social historian Mike Brown. This industrial complex was introduced by activists and scholars to contest the beliefs that increased levels of crime were the root cause of increasing prison populations. They argued that prison construction and the desire to fill these structures with people were driven by ideologies of racism and the pursuit of profit, not for rehabilitation. If you remember earlier in this video, I noted a quote by Ruth Gilmore, in which she said that abolitionists must be internationalists, and in my opinion, this is very much true. On a global scale, the US, China, and Russia have the highest numbers of prisoners and hold half of the world's prison population, which is about 9 million. Other countries such as Brazil, India, Mexico and South Africa also have large prisoner populations. Incarceration is not only restricted to the pen, as it also includes refugee camps and immigrant detention centers. Of the 17 million people forcibly displaced in the world, about 29 million of them are refugees. This displacement is usually the result of imperialism conducted by many of the Western countries that now present themselves as a safe haven for those who have been displaced in the global South. Moreover, American policies such as the war on drugs, which have been adopted in many countries globally, also impact the rates of incarceration. In many of these countries, many of the prisoners face human rights violations, overcrowding, unsanitary prison conditions, torture, long-term psychological and physical harm, suicide, PTSD, and more issues. Worldwide, the common thread is that most prisoners come from poor and marginalized communities in their societies. We need to change this. So a population of prisoners that are often ignored by scholars, by most people alike, are women in prison. Women were simply thought to be unable to be socially and criminally deviant until the end of the 18th century, when imprisonment emerged as a dominant form of punishment. Because of this, women who commit crimes have always been deemed more abnormal and deviant than the general population of women, because as it is usually understood, crime is a young man's game. Obviously, women have been punished through institutions long before the prison industrial complex, as men often back in the day would place their wives in mental institutions if they, didn't cook dinner for them, or they were acting abnormal, or if they were acting mentally unstable, usually from something they did. In this way, deviance, as it is constructed and gendered, is insanity for women, and often the deviance is also hypersexualized. In the 19th century, the reform movement called for separate prisons for women in England and the United States, arguing that women could also be rehabilitated like their male counterparts, as, like I said earlier, people didn't really believe that women committed crime, and so when they did see women who did commit crimes, it was believed that those women were passed from salvation. In these new women's prisons, there were architectural changes, domestic regimes, and all-female custodial staff. Prison staff performed rehabilitation by teaching women to be appropriate women. However, these reforms did not impact Black and Indigenous women in the same way, as they were segregated and sentenced quite differently from their white counterparts. Actually, at the time, women were usually sentenced to do more time than men, just because of the whole idea that women who committed crime were abnormal, so they needed to stay in jail longer in comparison to men. The reforms were carried into the 20th century, as in some women's prisons in the 1950s, women were taught to cook, sew, and clean, but this system of domestic training was never actually given to Black and Indigenous women. Moving onwards in time, the domestic trainings of the 50s receded, but the levels of repression increased as sexual abuse was and is an institutional part of the prison walls. Practices like the strip search, leniency on prison guards who have sexually abused prisoners, pelvic examinations by prison doctors, and more have all contributed to this rampant issue. For instance, in 2018, prisoners in Alberta, Canada made 67 allegations of sexual assaults in the last 5 fiscal years, and only one of those charges led to a criminal charge. Or in the case of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, from the years 2014 to 2018, the office fired at least 6 male correctional officers for sexually abusing women in their office. And I'm sure there were probably much more in both cases. Women's prisons were and still are repressive, as women, especially women of color and transgender women who are sometimes placed in male prisons, not only face the issues that come with being incarcerated, but also sexual and physical abuse by prison guards and staff, which is very rampant. The prison system is so rampant that it even feeds into our school systems, as Black and brown students are disproportionately becoming incarcerated through laws like school disturbance laws and zero tolerance practices in schools. This topic honestly deserves a video of its own. And so I asked the question, how can we consider a system that is ready to cage young children a necessary system, or a system that can be reformed? How?
I would like to see it.
So I don't think anyone who has been tuned into what's been happening recently will question why I would want to abolish the police. But if you're not convinced, I will just state some facts. Between 2000 and 2017, Canadian police were involved in 460 fatal interactions with civilians across Canada, and it wasn't until recently that Canadians were even able to get to see a comprehensive analysis of these interactions between civilians and the police. Indigenous people only make up about 4.8% of the population, yet they represented 15% of the total fatalities. Black people only make up to 3.4% of the population in Canada, yet they represented 9% of the fatalities. Both racial groups are disproportionately affected by police violence relative to other ethnicities. If it wasn't for the CBC's investigation into the Canadian police in their series Deadly Force, we would have never known of these statistics. Because not only are crimes monitored differently in Canada, but they're also covered by the press very differently in Canada. In the UK, the use of force is more than 2 times as likely to be a factor in the deaths of Black people in custody. In a given year, 4,224 people are killed by police brutality in Brazil. In Jamaica, a country of approximately 2 million people, 101 citizens were killed by law enforcement in 2015, and killings by police represent 8% of the country's homicides. I could keep going, so abolish the police. Get them out of here.
What? Child. Anyway, so
this system of violence that we see in prisons, the police force, also exists in the military-industrial complex. This is a big topic that also needs a video of its own. So, what I'm going to say about the military is this. I'm going to reiterate a statement by Angela Davis. These systems generate huge profits from processes of social destruction, precisely that which is advantageous to corporations, elected officials, and government agents who have obvious stakes in the expansion of these systems, begets grief and devastation for poor and racially dominated communities throughout the world. The transformation of imprisoned bodies, and they are in their majority bodies of color, into sources of profit, who consume and also often produce all kinds of commodities, devours public funds which might otherwise be available for social programs such as education, housing, childcare, recreation, and drug programs. So, why not reform? As Angela Davis observes, it is ironic that the prison itself was a product of efforts by reformers to create a better system of punishment. If the word prison reform so easily slipped from our lips, it is because prison and reform have been inextricably linked since the beginning of the use of imprisonment as the main means of punishing those who violate social norms. I think the question we need to be asking ourselves is, why do we need prisons? Why must we create a system to replace it? Why is there a need for crime and punishment and a single alternative system? Reform has been the basis of the prison industrial complex and policing, and not much has changed. Why are we creating policies that are not being followed by police and state and nation and federal officials when we can address the social issues of poverty, mental health, racism, sexism, and more that impact the criminalization of people. Hi everyone, this is just something I wanted to drop in here as I was editing this video. So a few days before I started editing this video, I actually read this article by Dr. Joy James, which is linked in the description box down below, in which Dr. James talks about Angela Davis and her image and her representation and like her dealings with the Black Power movement and the Black Panther Party. Quick note, did you know that Angela Davis was not in the Black Panther Party? She was in a different party kind of within her university. It was called like Black Panther, it was like BPPP or something like that, but it was not the same Black Panther Party that we know of. And Huey Newton actually like accosted her for this. It's just very interesting that her image has become so synonymous with the Black Panther Party. Black Power Party, Black Panther Child did the same thing. Okay, so Dr. James brings this up so that we can think about the validation and the legitimacy the movement of abolition has received within academia. As the academy is a space of elitism, it's very interesting that so much of the work that is heralded concerning prison abolition is not by former prisoners, rather it's being spearheaded by academics. So many of these syllabus lists about abolition are filled with the work of academics and not prisoners themselves, even though prisoners have written about abolition extensively. She also critiques our understanding of the academy as a place where revolutionary thought can be activated, if that's the right word. I couldn't really think of like a word to like kind of encapsulate what she said. As she says, there's nothing about the academy that has revolutionary desire, as our insights come from action. I actually think this is a very important intervention of sorts, if we could call it an intervention. She also critiques the ideas of abolition, and she talks about how a movement like abolition is a direct critique of predatory structures. And for many Black people who directly challenge these structures, the utility of violence is what the state will always employ. So we need to be looking beyond the state, like looking for a third way, because the state has made it clear that they will not listen to redress. And if you look at abolition, it is a redress of the state, essentially, because we're saying, you know, state violence is what we need to get rid of. Carceral state violence is what we need to get rid of. Police state violence is what we need to get rid of. Dr. James also notes that she only had the violent... Somebody's talking. Dr. James also notes that she only sees people who are able to see this third way as those who have been incarcerated and have had the violence of the prison industrial complex welded against them, not academics. Of course, you could easily say that Dr. James herself is critiquing something that she also engages with, regardless of if she may be at the margins of academia. She's still part of the apparatus that she is critiquing. I bring this up because it was an intervention that kind of gave me pause. It made me really think about this whole thing, to be honest, because I think Dr. James' critiques are very poignant, and I also realized that most of my sources in making this video were academic, so she really has a point there. So, gives me something to think about. I would just like to add that the book list I suggested in the description box down below does include books written by former incarcerated people. I made sure of that just to pay attention to what Dr. James said, because that really gave me some sort of conviction. Okay, edit over, back to the video. So, what will a carceral-free, police-free world look like? Well, abolitionists offer models such as the attrition model, in which the goals of declaring a moratorium, decarceration, excarceration, so stopping from putting people in prisons, and building a caring community of people are the main sectors of abolition. Obviously, this process will take some time, but we can begin with many steps for each sector in the attrition model. We can also present as many other models as possible, as I don't believe there is a singular way to really go about this. I think we should consider many different ways. Our communities should be the focus in all models, as we ask ourselves if the models we create help develop a caring community of people. Actions like developing a network of community support services, supporting ex-prisoners and peer assistant groups and centers, supporting prisoner unions, supporting prisoners' voting rights. That's really important, guys. We must develop victim assistance, restitution, and compensation programs. We must decriminalize crimes and get as many prisoners out of jail as possible. But you may respond to all I've spent saying in this video by saying, girl, what about violent offenders, serial killers, sexual assaulters, domestic violence? These are questions people bring up constantly in these abolition discussions, and while I think these are very important questions that we need to be thinking about and need to be asking, I also think that sometimes the police might not be called upon in many of these types of situations as much as we think they actually do. If you're looking for some response to those questions, For Harriet and Jules Z both have made great videos about abolition which answer many of these concerns, and I will link those videos in the description box below. But I also encourage people to seek out the answers on their own. You have to question these things on your own. I have included a list of books that I think are great starts, because if you've been thinking about the possibilities of abolition, you started challenging ideas that we've been socialized to see as true and natural. And that's a good thing. Okay, thank you for watching, and as always, I appreciate all the recent subscribers to this channel. I'm very interested in hearing everybody's ideas around abolition, so I'd love to see some comments down below if you could. I'm also starting a new incentive in hopes to engage with you all more, just because I don't have a community page just yet. So this is how I'm going to keep engaged. If you'd like to see more from me, follow me on Instagram at Black Wahala. I'll actually start posting on Thursdays and Fridays, and I also plan to do some live sessions, and we can just talk about whatever is interesting or important or whatever people are talking about at that time. But I need y'all to follow me on Instagram so I can have more than my brother and my sister tuning into my live. So please follow me on Instagram. If Instagram isn't really your thing, you can also follow me on Twitter at Black Wahala. Please, I'm begging y'all, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Matter of fact, I'll give you some time right now to like and subscribe. Go ahead. Okay, thanks for doing that if you did. I'll see y'all in the next video. Bye.